Well, happy New Year's Eve, everybody. I gotta say, it feels a little less party time and a little more apocalypse pending out there, right?
You're not wrong.
But hey, that's what we're here for, right? To dive deep into this mess and try to make some sense of it all.
Exactly.
You sent over a mountain of news articles, clips, even your own notes. And it's obvious you're trying to connect the dots between, well, everything. Wars, politics, the economy, even a little Bigfoot action in there.
It is a lot to unpack, but that's what fresh perspectives are for. So we're going to sort through the chaos together, see if we can find some surprises along the way.
Sounds like a plan. Okay, so just skimming through what you sent, it really seems like the human cost to these global conflicts is what's hitting you the hardest. You've highlighted stories of regular people caught in the crosshairs.
Yeah, I think that's the right place to start. It's easy to get lost in the big picture of war, but the individual stories, they're what make it real.
You know what I mean.
Like that prisoner exchange between Russia and Ukraine, you flagged that one. Facilitated by the UAE. You could talk geopolitics all day long, but what sticks with you is those families reuniting, right? After years of not knowing.
Oh, absolutely. And some of the articles you sent, they describe those reunions so powerfully. It's like this tiny spark of light in all that darkness.
It is. But even within that, there's this tension, right? You see how differently soldiers versus civilians are thinking about peace talks.
Yeah, that jumped out at me too.
You got veterans like Sert, this Ukrainian soldier who's seen some horrific stuff. For him, negotiation feels like a betrayal of everything they fought for. Then you got civilians in these bombed-out cities like Dnipro. They just want some kind of normalcy back, even if it means tough compromises.
It's just layers upon layers, isn't it? It's not just lines on a map or political slogans. It's millions of people stuck in the middle, each one with their own story.
And that's the thing we got to remember. And then, of course, there's Gaza. I mean, that humanitarian crisis, it's just horrifying.
You highlighted some sources that paint this just awful picture of families trying to survive in these makeshift shelters.
Yeah.
Even babies dying from the cold.
Yeah. That's the kind of stuff that doesn't always make the headlines, you know, the real nitty-gritty of it. Both Ukraine and Gaza, you're talking about impossible decisions for people.
Do you go back to a home that might not even be safe anymore? Do you cling to life in conditions that are barely livable?
Right. And it's a question we should all be asking ourselves. What compromises would I be willing to make if I were in their shoes? Where's that line between hope and just facing the brutal truth?
Seriously.
Yeah.
It makes you think about what you really believe in. But moving past the immediate impact of these wars, you also pointed out how things that seem totally separate can actually trigger a domino effect around the world.
Oh, yeah, the ripple effect is huge. Think about that end to Russian gas transit through Ukraine, the one going to the EU. On the surface, it's just an energy spat, but it represents this massive shift. Russia loses this huge leverage it had over Europe.
And the EU's had to scramble to replace all that gas, haven't they?
Big time. It's been pretty impressive, though, ramping up those liquid natural gas imports from places like Qatar, the U.S., more piped gas from Norway. They even created a system to, reroute gas from Greece and Turkey. But all that quick shifting comes with its own problem.
Just shows how interconnected everything is, right?
Yeah, absolutely. One event, even something as seemingly simple as an energy dispute, can have these huge impacts that reach across continents. And some countries are getting hit way harder than others. Moldova, for instance, they're in a full-blown energy crisis now, largely because they relied so heavily on Russia for gas.
They're basically accusing Russia of using energy as a weapon.
And it's a vulnerability that goes way beyond this one conflict.
Right, it's like a wake-up call.
Yeah.
Don't rely on just one source for anything, whether it's energy, food, whatever. Makes a country super vulnerable. Putting all your eggs in one basket, and that basket is made of, wet tissue paper.
Exactly. And it underscores the importance of thinking ahead, having options. This world is only getting more volatile, more unpredictable.
Okay, before we move on, there's this one thing in your notes that I just half-ee to ask about. Those two people who died looking for Bigfoot in Washington State. It's like this weird little blip in a week full of global crises, but I feel like you're connecting it to something bigger.
Good catch. Yeah, it might seem like a quirky little story, but it actually ties into what we've been talking about, how fragile our ideas about safety and preparedness really are. Whether it's going out into the wilderness unprepared or relying on these big, complex systems, we often think we're more secure than we really are.
It's like we're walking around with this false sense of security, like nothing bad could ever really happen.
And that's the dangerous part. It reminds me of that huge blackout in Puerto Rico right on New Year's Eve. Their power grid is still so fragile. even years after Hurricane Maria. Just like those Bigfoot hunters, they got caught completely off guard by something they never saw coming.
It's a good reminder that we should always be thinking about those what-if scenarios and having some kind of backup plan, whether it's a power outage or, I don't know, a sudden Bigfoot encounter. Acknowledging that we're not invincible, that's the first step to actually being prepared.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So we've talked about the human cost of war, how seemingly unrelated events can set off chain reactions all over the place, and how easily our systems can break down. It feels like there's this underlying theme here about power, the struggle for control, both globally and in our personal lives.
Definitely a common thread running through all this stuff. And one of the most dramatic examples, Syria. Specifically, the rise of this group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS for short. A lot of governments consider them a terrorist organization. They're gaining influence, and it's reshaping the entire region.
Yeah, and you mentioned how they're trying to present this image of unity, even meeting with Christian and Kurdish representatives. But then at the same time, they're putting foreign fighters into leadership roles in the Syrian army.
It does seem contradictory. Makes you wonder what their real goals are. Do they actually want a unified Syria that respects everyone, like their leader claims? Or are they just making these moves to grab more power and force their own ideology on everyone?
Tough one to figure out.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder if true peace and unity are even possible when everyone's fighting for control.
It's a classic problem in post-conflict situations. The lines get blurry, ideology, power, just plain survival.
It's a reminder that even when a dictator like Assad is gone, the road to a stable and just society, it's not a straight line.
Nope, not at all. And it shows how important it is to think critically to understand what's motivating all the different players.
Speaking of motivations, we got to talk about this Brad Spafford case in Virginia. This guy got busted with a whole arsenal of homemade bombs, some even labeled lethal. And he said he wanted to assassinate the vice president, Kamala Harris. It's terrifying. Proof that extremist ideas can lead to real-world violence.
What's really scary is the connection to that No Lives Matter movement. They openly encourage violence and crime as part of their belief system. Spafford's case shows how that stuff can go from online talk to actual plans to hurt people.
It makes you wonder how many people out there hold these extreme views and how many might be on the verge of actually acting on them.
It is a sobering thought, but there's a bit of hope in this story too. The FBI got tipped off by a neighbor, a former law enforcement officer who recognized the danger. It shows that we can make a difference. Sometimes just one person speaking up can stop something terrible from happening.
Exactly. We all have a responsibility to be vigilant, to say something if we see red flags.
Couldn't agree more. Sometimes that's all it takes, one person's courage.
Okay, before we move on to the next batch of stories you've sent, let's just take a moment to acknowledge the passing of President Jimmy Carter, a true icon.
Absolutely. His dedication to peace, to human rights, to diplomacy, it's a legacy that should inspire all of us.
It is. And it's especially interesting to look back at what he did with China back in 1979, normalizing relations. It was a huge deal at the time.
Game changer. It opened up China to the world.
And now, some people are saying it paved the way for China to become this economic and military superpower, maybe even a rival to the U.S.
It's complicated, that's for sure. No easy answers. But it highlights how diplomatic decisions can have these really long-term consequences, ones that nobody could have predicted.
And speaking of unpredictable, you flagged the situation in South Korea with their suspended president, Yoon Suk-yeol. There's an arrest warrant out for him, abuse of power, inciting an insurrection. It just shows that political turmoil can happen anywhere, even in democracies that seem pretty solid.
Absolutely. It's like a case study in how fragile those democratic institutions can be.
Yeah.
Yoon's refusing to cooperate with the investigation. It's a standoff between the executive and judicial branches of government. It'll be interesting to see how this all plays out.
Okay, I think we need a break from all this heavy stuff for a minute. Let's talk space. You sent some stuff about this debate over humans versus robots in space exploration.
Always a fun one.
It's a hot topic, especially with all the successes we've seen with robots lately. Like that Indian space docking mission, you included an article about that. It shows how far these unmanned spacecraft have come.
Oh, yeah, they're doing some incredible stuff these days.
It's amazing. But you also pointed out how some people are saying there's just no replacement for having actual humans out there exploring.
Right. Lord Martin Rees, he's the UK's astronomer royal. He makes a really good point. Robots are just more practical in a lot of ways. They're cheaper. They can handle conditions that would kill a human. They don't need all that life support stuff. Logistically, they make a ton of sense.
True. But then you have someone like Leroy Chow, a retired astronaut, who says robots are missing that essential human element, the curiosity, the wonder, the inspiration that comes from pushing the boundaries of what we can do.
And that inspiration, it's not just some feel-good thing, it actually has an impact. Think about all the scientists, the engineers, the kids who dreamed of going to space. They were inspired by those grainy images of Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. It sparked this sense of possibility that drives innovation to this day.
It does make you wonder if robots, even with all their fancy tech, can ever capture that feeling of a human actually experiencing the unknown.
And it's not just about inspiration. Some people argue that humans are just better at problem solving on the fly, making discoveries that robots with their programmed algorithms could never even imagine.
So maybe it doesn't have to be one or the other. Maybe the future of space exploration is about using the best of both worlds. Robots doing the initial scouting, gathering data, and then humans coming in with their intuition and adaptability to make sense of it all.
I like that idea. Teamwork.
Okay, enough about space for now. Let's bring things back down to Earth, or at least to Hollywood. You flagged the never-ending drama that is the Jolie Pitt divorce, and I have to say, even with all the global chaos going on, it's hard to look away.
Oh, I know. It's both fascinating and kind of sad to watch. They announced their separation 8 years ago, and the legal battles just drag on and on.
This celebrity lawyer, Chris Melcher, even said it's much longer than any divorce we typically see. You got to wonder if all that money and fame, instead of making things easier, actually make it even more complicated.
I'd say so. They're fighting over a fortune, custody of 6 kids, even a vineyard in France. It shows that even with wealth and privilege, relationships can still fall apart in spectacular fashion.
It's a far cry from the fairy tale romance they had when they first got together. Makes you wonder what went wrong, and if they'll ever truly be able to move on from all this.
In all the mess, there is one good thing. The judge handling the case is really emphasizing putting the kids first. It's a good reminder that no matter how big and messy these celebrity battles get, the kids' needs should always be the priority.
That's a really good point. And speaking of long and complicated processes, let's talk about the Madoff Victim Fund. They're finally making their last payments to the people who got scammed by Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme after years of work.
That story shows the devastating impact financial fraud can have, but also the strength of the people who fought for justice. Madoff's scheme was like a work of art, all built on lies and greed. He targeted everyone, celebrities, regular investors, promising crazy returns.
Classic Ponzi scheme, right? Only works as long as new money keeps coming in. Eventually, the whole thing implodes, and the people at the bottom are left with nothing.
Exactly. And when Madoff's scheme crashed, it was a disaster. People lost everything, their savings, homes, their dreams. It's hard to even imagine how betrayed and hopeless those victims must have felt.
It's just awful. But in the middle of all that, the Madoff Victim Fund gave people some hope. Their goal was to get back as much of that stolen money as possible and give it back to the people who lost it. And they did an incredible job.
Oh yeah, they recovered almost 94% of the proven losses. It's amazing, really. Shows how dedicated they were to righting this wrong.
And for the victims, it wasn't just about the money. It was about justice, about seeing someone held accountable and taking a step toward rebuilding their lives.
You got it. Accountability and healing. That's what it's all about.
Okay, we've covered a lot, but there are still some really interesting stories you highlighted that I want to dig into. Let's switch gears and talk about some individual stories of, well, hope and resilience.
Sounds good to me. Well, one story that really stood out to me was that release of Rita Al-Yazidi from Guantanamo. 22 years, man, held without charges.
It's kind of symbolic, isn't it? Makes you think about the whole war on terror, what it's cost us.
Yeah. Justice, accountability. Al-Yazidi never even got charged with anything. Spent over 2 decades in a place that's got, well, a pretty bad reputation when it comes to human rights.
It does make you wonder, in the name of security, did we compromise some of our own values along the way? And what about the other people still there? How do we make sure those who were maybe wrongly imprisoned get justice?
Those are the big questions, for sure. Al-Yazidi getting out, it feels like one small step on this long road to, I don't know, maybe some kind of healing, both for the people directly affected and the world as a whole.
Yeah, heavy stuff. It reminds us that the choices we make, especially when fear is running high, they can have consequences that last for generations.
Yeah.
But let's switch gears for a sec. You also flagged this story that's just pure social media goodness. I'm talking about Sushi Lamina, that 10-year-old girl from India whose bowling video blew up thanks to Sachin Tendulkar.
Ah, that one's a heartwarmer. And get this, Sushila has no idea who Sachin Tendulkar even is. Her family doesn't have a TV, so she's totally oblivious to his fame.
Right. This just shows you raw talent shines through no matter what.
And it's kind of amazing how social media, for all the bad stuff, can connect people like this. Breaks down all those barriers of geography and culture, gives a platform to someone who might have otherwise been totally overlooked.
It's a good reminder that even when things feel chaotic and divided, there's still room for joy.
Yeah.
Shared experiences, celebrating those little unexpected things.
Couldn't agree more. And it kind of brings us back to why we do these deep dives, right?
Totally.
We're sifting through all the noise, the complexity, looking for those bits of meaning, the stories that remind us what really matters.
Okay, so we've gone from the battlefields of Ukraine to the streets of Gaza, from outer space to Guantanamo. Whew! We've wrestled with the weight of war, the fragility of the systems we rely on, the whole power struggle thing. But before we call it a night on this New Year's Eve deep dive, I got to throw one last thought out there.
Go for it. I'm listening.
The U.S. presidential election, it's just around the corner, and Donald Trump might actually come back. He's been hinting at it.
Yeah, that would shake things up, to say the least.
And it makes you wonder, especially with the war in Ukraine still going on, what would a Trump presidency mean for that whole situation, for that delicate balance of power that's been holding things together barely?
It's the question, right? And we got to think critically about it, consider all sides. Some people think Trump's, shall we say, unconventional approach to diplomacy, his willingness to talk to guys like Putin, that could actually lead to some kind of negotiated peace, even if it means compromises that some people won't like.
But others worry that he's just too unpredictable, that he's more interested in what's good for him than what's good for the world, and that could make things even worse. It's a tough one, no doubt.
No easy answers, but definitely something we need to think about as we head into this new year with all its uncertainty.
It reminds us that the choices we make, whether it's personal choices or choices as a country, they matter. They shape history. As we stand here on the edge of a new year, it's a good time to reflect on those choices, to have these conversations, to try and build a future where peace and justice win out.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I think that about wraps up our deep dive for tonight.
Yeah, I think so. We covered a lot tonight, from the really tough realities of war to those glimmers of hope and resilience. But what's important is that we talked about it, explored the messy, complicated world we're living in. Yeah. That's what these deep dives are all about.
Absolutely. Connecting with each other, understanding the world a little better, and feeling a little more equipped to face whatever comes next.
So as we raise a glass to the new year, let's hold on to those insights, the questions we've asked, and that hope that together we can make things better.
Happy New Year. It really does make you think, doesn't it? About those choices, how far they can reach. But you also flagged this story that, well, it makes you question if we even have e-choices sometimes. I'm talking about that woman, Debrina Kawam, the one who was set on fire on the subway in New York.
That one was rough. It's a reminder that there's this random violence out there that can just shatter your sense of security,
Yeah, and what's so disturbing is that it seems totally random. There's nothing to suggest she even knew the guy who did it, this Sebastian Zapata.
Right. Makes you wonder what leads to that kind of senseless violence, and how do you even stop it?
It's a tough question. Makes you realize that even in places we think are safe, there's always that possibility of danger just lurking around the corner.
It does. Makes you think about being more aware, more vigilant, but also about compassion, trying to understand the root causes of this kind of violence, whether it's societal problems, economic issues, mental health.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue. There's no easy fix. But shifting gears for a second, you also highlighted a story that reminds us how important it is to fight for justice, to hold those in power accountable. That arrest warrant for South Korea's president, Yoon Suk Yeol.
Oh, right. The investigation into abuse of power, inciting an insurrection, and now he's refusing to cooperate. It's a full-blown constitutional crisis.
It's wild, right?
Yeah.
Shows how even in a well-established democracy, things can go sideways pretty quickly.
It really does.
Underscores the importance of having an independent court system and citizens who are willing to stand up and say, hey, this isn't right.
It'll be interesting to see what happens next over there, that's for sure. But before we wrap up completely, I want to touch on something that's come up a few times tonight. This balance between progress and, well, the unintended consequences that often come with it.
Yeah, good point. We've seen it with war, diplomacy, technology, even just in our personal lives. Seems like every step forward comes with the potential for some unforeseen side
It's
effects.
like a cosmic game of whack-a-mole.
Exactly. And maybe one of the best examples is the debate over AI, especially when it comes to space exploration.
Mhm.
AI has the potential to revolutionize how we learn about the universe, but there are ethical considerations too, things we can't just ignore.
Like that point you made about robots possibly contaminating other planets with bacteria from Earth. It's a big question.
Yeah.
Are we asking the right questions? It's not just can robots explore, it's should they?
Exactly. It makes us think long term. What are the consequences of our actions? How do we grapple with the ethical issues that come with these new technologies? It's a conversation that's only going to get bigger as AI keeps advancing and plays a bigger role in how we explore space.
Man, we've covered some serious ground tonight, from the darkest parts of human experience to the incredible things we're capable of. It's been quite a ride.
That's a great way to put it, a real journey. And hopefully, for you listening, it's given you some new ways of looking at things, some things to think about as we head into the new year.
Well said. Happy New Year, everyone.